Welcome to this week's Newsmakers edition of HUR at Home. I'm Bramante Bryant. Tonight, we'll discuss the protests that have been sweeping across our country and how civil rights movements of the past, led by African Americans pushing for freedom, equality, and justice, how all of that links to what is happening today. And the person who is going to link all of that together today, she has unique insight into those historical connections as chronicled in her new book that she has authored. Karen Gray Houston, 4 decades as a broadcast journalist and now a renowned author, joins us tonight at HUR at Home. And I must say, a friend of mine. Karen, thank you so much.
We go way back.
What'd you say?
We go way back.
Oh, yes, way, way back. So, Karen, you have written this book. I could probably hold it up here a little bit. It's behind you, over your shoulder, folks. You can see it here. Daughter of the Boycott, Carrying On a Montgomery Family Civil Rights Legacy. And before we get into all of the particulars of the book, I want to sort of talk a little bit about how, I led into it. Madness going on over the last 2 weeks, but controlled madness, after we got past that first week and the protest. Talk a little bit about how your book connects to what's happening out in the streets and in neighborhoods today.
Let me tell you first just a little bit about the book, just for context. This is a story about my family's involvement in the Montgomery bus boycott. My father was an organizer. He drove his car. He picked up Black passengers so that they wouldn't get on the buses. He was arrested for his activism. Thomas Gray. My uncle, Fred Gray, his younger brother, was the boycott attorney. He represented Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and a young teenage girl named Claudette Colvin. We could probably talk about her later. She's kind of an unsung heroine of the whole thing. But my book, the first chapter of my book, does not start with the boycott. It starts with a case of white police brutality. In 1950, 5 years before the Rosa Parks incident, Hilliard Brooks is the name of the Black man who was trying to get a ride on a bus in downtown Montgomery, who was shot and killed by a white police officer. He was a friend of my father's. They played street football together. They were both veterans of World War II. My dad was teaching some classes at a Catholic school for Negroes, what they called us back in the day. And this guy Hilliard was getting some veterans training there. And so when Dad found out about it, he was outraged, and the commander of their AMVETS unit at the school, they were all very upset and wanted to do something about it. So Dad and this guy, Ron Young, wrote a letter to the city officials saying this guy should be prosecuted, a white police officer, I'd be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Does this sound familiar? White Police Review Board found the shooting justifiable. And so my dad led a protest, and there were hundreds of veterans, and they marched downtown, and they called it was a protest with a purpose. And they didn't want to be arrested for loitering for marching, and so they marched to the courthouse where they could register to vote. So, and they held up signs that said ballots will beat bullets. The difference in the protest is that, theirs was really a peaceful, nonviolent protest. Nobody was looting any buildings or burning anything down or vandalizing any structures. But, at the end of the day, where did it get them? That white police officer finished his career and probably, got his pension. So it's, there's different from what's going on, but upsetting because these things continue to happen. That racial profiling and racism in policing doesn't seem to change.
What did you think once the George Floyd issue happened and the Ahmaud Arbery happened? And now these aren't first, right? But the George Floyd incident, because we watched it, really on, not while it was happening, but on tape. And so now you have this book that's out, and that it really ties into what was happening. What went through your mind when you saw what was happening? Did you go, oh my gosh, my book deals with so much of this issue in terms of police and the interaction with African Americans?
Oh, how prophetic. I wasn't really thinking that. I was
Hmm.
thinking as I went on the journey to write the book, I kept encountering the same kinds of things. I mean,
Hmm.
in 1950, there was the Hilliard Brooks case. And then in 2015, there was a whole slew, a rash of incidents involving Michael Brown in
Hmm.
Ferguson, Missouri, and then Eric Garner in New York, and Freddie Gray killed in police custody in Baltimore. And I thought, oh my goodness. And I was writing some opinion pieces for the Montgomery Advertiser, the newspaper in Montgomery at the time. And what people were starting to say was, you saw an eruption of student protests all over the country. And people were saying, this is going to be different this time. Things are going to be different because everybody has a telephone with a camera. And so we're going to see these incidents documented. And there was a call for more police body cameras. And people were thinking, okay, once you're going to be able to stop some of the police brutality because you're going to see it on camera, on the body cameras or on people's cell phones. And then what happened? It happened again. So,
Hmm.
2016, I'm still working on the book, still doing the research. In Montgomery, in a little neighborhood called Mobile Heights, where my family lived when I was a small child. And I went to the neighborhood, walked through the neighborhood, and I saw these signs in everybody's yards that said, "Justice for Greg Gunn." Who was Greg Gunn? Greg Gunn was a Black man who left a card party in his neighborhood, in my old neighborhood, to go
Hmm.
home at 2 o'clock one morning, and a police officer cruising through the neighborhood stopped him. There was some sort of encounter. The policeman tased him, beat him, chased him, and shot him and killed him. I think he fired 5 shots from his gun, so I guess he wanted to be sure.
Hmm.
It took until December of last year for that case to finally be fully adjudicated and for a verdict to come out. And so I don't know what to think of the fact that we can't seem to stop this. That
Well,
was then.
no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Then I'm feeling a little more hopeful now because the
Hmm.
tenure of the protests that we're seeing now is different. They're larger, they're much more diverse. You're seeing a lot more white people involved. They're
Hmm.
all over the country, and they have extended past our borders to the overseas. It's global now, and
Right.
so there are all these demands for change, and so something's got to happen.
But it's interesting that you actually mentioned some of the white allies in your book. I'm trying to remember Virginia and
And
what
Clifford Durr.
Clifford Burke, right? That didn't live that far from you, right?
They lived well, in Montgomery, everything's about a 5 minute drive. So they were. Clifford Durr was a prominent white attorney who
Hmm.
really helped my uncle Fred Gray. He gives him credit for helping to make him the good attorney that he has become. And they were people who were not afraid to be involved with Black people, and they were alienated by their friends, ostracized, because they were helpful. The two of them actually bailed Rosa Parks out after she was arrested. Edie
Hmm.
Nixon, the Black community leader who called
Right.
called the police station and said, "Hey, I heard Rosa Parks was arrested. How much do I have to pay for the bail?" And they wouldn't talk to him because he was a
Hmm.
Black man.
Right.
So he had to call Clifford Durr, and
Mm.
Clifford Durr and his wife went to bail her out. But
This,
there were many white allies, and I was surprised to find out how many when I
hmm.
started research. I knew about a couple who they were lifelong friends of my parents, the Gratzes,
Right.
Reverend Bob and Jimmy Gratz. They pastored a predominant and almost all Black Lutheran church,
Hmm.
and they also were friends with Rosa Parks. But their their parsonage, and they had small children, their parsonage was bombed 3 times by the Ku Klux Klan because of their activism and assistance in the boycott. There have been white people who have helped.
You talk, there's a section in your book, and you mentioned her early on about Claudette Colvin. And I remember it was a couple of years ago, either there was an editorial in Washington Post or the New York Times talking about how she was the forgotten one in terms of the bus boycott. And you highlight her prominently in the book. Talk a little bit about her, because her story really is fascinating. And it also reminds us of really how young many of those protesters, like today, were during that sort of modern civil rights movement of the 50s up through the late 60s.
They tend to all be young. Martin Luther King was 26 years old.
That's right.
My uncle had just gotten out of law school. He was 23. My dad was 29. They were young people. Claudette Colvin was even younger. She was a teenager. She was 15 years old. And this was 9 months before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. Claudette did the same thing. She was on a bus with a lot of her student friends, and the bus got crowded, and a white woman got on, and the bus driver said he needed a seat. And what that meant in the day was, if everybody in a whole row had to get up, all the black people had to get up so the white person could sit down, because the white person didn't want to sit next to a black person in 2 seats together, and didn't want to have 2 seats on the other side with black people over there. So, but Claudette,
it's so hard to imagine that today too, Karen, for young people, because oftentimes, you want to be in the back of the bus. And so to know, that you had to move, but continue. I just always find that fascinating now that, we didn't want to be told we had to be in the back of the bus. I guess you just want to be able to know I can sit in the front or the back if I want to.
Exactly. Well, the bus driver summoned the police, and 2 police officers got on the bus and dragged Claudette off and arrested her. And my uncle thought, oh, perfect. This will be the test case. We'll test segregated seating on the buses, and we'll use this case. Except that two months later, Claudette got pregnant, and leaders of the movement in Montgomery decided that they really didn't want a pregnant, unwed mother to be the face of their fight. And so people didn't, if they had initially.
But listen, you say when you talk to your uncle, that was not his position. He said, I didn't know anything about her being pregnant. I didn't have any reservations from that standpoint. Did you feel he was being authentic there, or were you surprised of his response?
You have to know my uncle. Fred Gray is a very religious man. He was a minister before he became a lawyer. And to this day, he's still a leader in his church and occasionally will preach a sermon. And so it was not his concern if she was pregnant or not. That was not going to be an issue to him. It wasn't as if he was going to sit down and lord over her and judge her because she was pregnant. Long story short, there were other women who were also arrested for doing the exact same thing, refusing to get up. And there was a woman, Joanne Robinson, who was the head of a group called the Women's Political Council, and they were taking notes. She was a teacher, an English teacher at Alabama State College, and she sent her students out on buses to write down the names of people, bus drivers and bus numbers and routes, and just to, documenting egregious behavior. And they started meeting with city officials and officials from the bus company, the bus line, to basically just demand better treatment for Black people. And by this time, Martin Luther King had come to town. He was in on the meetings, and Fred Gray was, a lawyer in town. He was in on the meetings. And so there was that kind of activity that was going on. But the lawsuit that was ultimately filed in federal court involved all the women but Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks' case was a disorderly conduct case. was going through the local courts. And my uncle's feeling was, I want to have a case that can be successful. And I don't think having anything to do with the local courts is going to help. So he wanted to file his case in federal court. And he had Aurelia Browder and Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith. And there was another one, Susie McDonald. Right. They were all plaintiffs in the federal case that went up to the Supreme Court that ultimately struck down segregation. And Rosa Parks was not on that lawsuit, and people don't know that. Though Rosa Parks went on to become the mother of the civil rights movement, and is really equated with, when you talk about the narrative of what happened during the bus boycott, you think about Rosa Parks. And these other women just got lost in the shuffle of history. Nobody really thinks much about them, but they really are the main reason, the main reason that the segregation was outlawed.
And they've received some honors, right? One of the museums down there in Alabama has recognized them and their efforts, but it hasn't sort of been on the national sort of stage as Rosa Parks. And again, there's so much in there too that we could get into that I just thought was fascinating. Even the part about Rosa Parks and where Claudette Colvin felt like, part of that was colorism, where it leaned towards Rosa Parks. She was a more light skinned, and she felt like because she was dark skinned that she would be more acceptable, Rosa Parks. So even those stories are fascinating. But what in this great book I hold up again that you found most surprising that you discovered, because you went back and you had notes from when you talked to your dad who's passed, your uncle was still living, but you talked about sort of just walking around and going into meetings and telling people, hey, I'm writing this book, and people pulling you aside going, oh, you really need to know this story. What was there anything in particular that sort of stunned you, that was a revelation to you?
I'm going to say I was surprised at every turn. It was a journey of discovery. All these stories I never knew. My father didn't talk to me about them really until I got to be an adult. And my younger brother was smart enough to say, you need to sit Dad down in front of a camera and interview him and find out all these things. And he told me things, and I learned things from the Library of Congress has Rosa Parks papers. I joined a couple of civic organizations in Montgomery and asked people, can you point me to somebody who might have been a maid or a white woman who had a maid? And a woman at one of the civic meetings, breakfast meetings, said, oh, you need to talk to me. My father was Clyde Sellers. Well, he was the racist police commissioner during the boycott. He was the kind of guy who had his knee on people's necks, right? And so I talked to her about, because I wanted to know what were the other people thinking about. I mean, I kind of knew what Black people in my neighborhood, what was on our minds, but what about the white people? So I found people like her who talked about her father, and she saw him as a man, but later was a kind of a rebellious person, and has had to reconcile how she feels about his history. Lots of stories. The son and daughter-in-law of the manager of the bus company talked to me about some letters that they were given by the bus company. Bus company went out of business. The boycott really was effective.
Were you surprised? Were you surprised that people like that would be willing to speak with you? And what do you think that said? Was it that they were looking for some reconciliation, or it shows sort of the progress that's been made, that these white folks whose father, mother, uncle, aunt, cousins were involved in things that would not be seen as positive today, willing to share some of the information on sort of where they were during that point with you?
Why did they talk to me? For maybe many reasons. Some of it is, it's an aging population. It's been there's a lot of distance between what happened then and what happened now. They've had a long time to think about it. Nobody's been asking them what they felt. It's been, you know, a lot of the books that at first, nobody cared about the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King wrote a book in 1958, and there really weren't a lot of books about it until, you know, 30, 40 years later. And so my uncle wrote a book, Bus Ride to Justice. There have been, you know, several books. And then in recent history, just a few stories here and there. And so I decided I wanted to go down there and get some oral histories, go into people's homes, sit down, look them in the eye and say, would you tell me, try to explain to me what was going on then that I don't know about? And that people might be about.
Yeah, I was going to say that's just a lesson for all of us, especially African Americans, especially with our culture being so rooted also in oral histories. But you've got to get those stories, and you're so fortunate to have them and now have them bound, right, for all of us to read and see. Even Oprah and the Smithsonian, you are the accolades. Look at that, great timing.
June issue. I'm one of the 10 titles. What does it say? 10 titles to pick up now. I can't see it. Yeah, I can't show it.
Yeah, well, we know it's in Oprah's magazine. I see it.
And that is Smithsonian Magazine has been telling people, recommending books for people to read since they're sheltered at home. And earlier, well, I guess in May, they recommended mine as one of 5 books to read one week. So I'm happy that people are interested in the story and that they like it.
It's fantastic. Karen, so folks watching, tell them how they can get the book, because they should get it.
Easy to get the book. Oh, just go to my website, KarenGrayHouston.com. You can get the book and you can see a book trailer. I have people who say, don't call it a trailer, it's a book preview.
Well, I love the trailer, though. If we could run it, we would. But it's, you know, I'm big on video, so it's a fantastic trailer. But Karen, it is always great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thanks to you for all that you've done. And thanks to those who are watching for this week's edition of Newsmakers on WHUR at Home. Be safe, be powerful. Good night. And Karen, be well.
Thank you, Bramante. I enjoyed it.
All righty.